Well, good morning, Father's House. It is good to see you today on this beautiful Tuesday. I am your host, Gordon, here with another episode of Beyond the Message, where we dive deeper into Sunday's sermon. I'm joined today by Pastor Josh and Pastor Carrie.
Morning.
And we are excited to get back into it and talking about number 2 in the Dear God series. Pastor Marlize spoke this Sunday about why am I so lonely? We're all lonely in our own ways.
Lonely.
And yes, I was going to sing that, but you don't.
I was also
nobody wants
singing,
to hear that.
What is the lonely? You know that song?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's true. Loneliness is, I think, one of, if not the most shared experience I think that we all maybe have as people, not even Christians, just as people. It's such a common thing to feel, and you can feel it. And I really enjoyed this kind of breakdown that Pastor Marlize went through, because there's a lot to it. There's a lot to loneliness, and it can come in a lot of shapes and forms, and it doesn't always present in the same kinds of situations, where it's not always that, and this was one of the kind of assumptions that she was talking about. We make these assumptions that, like, oh, if I just had people, or friends or whatever, but it's so easy to, even in surrounded by people, it's possible to feel lonely. And I think it's a lot kind of deeper than sort of what we like to think it is. We think it's this easy fix sometimes, I think. And maybe you guys can talk to this as we sort of open up into the topic on sort of how it kind of presents in your life, and maybe some of those misconceptions and how that kind of can hold us back from really getting through it and digging into the deeper issue, which I think we'll get into in a bit. But what do you guys think? How do you guys feel? You guys feeling lonely today, or?
So I do think a lot of people misconstrue loneliness with being alone.
Yeah.
Because I know Marley said this during first service, like, you can be married and be lonely. Mm-hmm. Loneliness, actually, I think loneliness has more to do with not feeling understood.
Yeah.
And that's why our communion with God is so important, because ultimately no one will truly understand us like God. So I love that she kind of broke that barrier down at the very beginning, because you can be in a room of people and feel super lonely.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great.
Josh hasn't had his morning coffee yet.
Yeah, it's in here though. So there's 2. I put 2 in here.
Two coffees? All right.
Yeah,
all right.
How many sugars and creamers?
Yeah. Is that all right?
No, good.
Talk
Yeah.
about the coffee
yeah,
intake?
please talk about the coffee.
Right.
Yeah.
No, you said all right. Like, oh God, here we go.
No, I was going to be like, if you can start chugging that if you want.
I was thinking about loneliness.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think certain seasons of your life, lonely, you can find yourself a little more lonely.
Yeah.
And sometimes it kind of creeps up on you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh my God, like, this is actually a lonely place. Sometimes it's okay. Sometimes loneliness is okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just, what do you do with your loneliness? Does your loneliness result in boredom? Because my parents always said boredom is the devil's playground. You know what I mean? But sometimes it is okay to be bored.
Right.
I'll drink to that.
Okay.
Well, and even I think with loneliness, where does it, like you're saying, where does it drive you?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's such a great point. I'm just thinking more about what you said, in certain seasons of life, or
Right.
maybe you're in a new position at work and you're leading. One of my favorite books of all time talks about how in positions of leadership, there is a major element of loneliness, because you're making decisions. And if you're a Christ follower, you're not making decisions based off of what people want. You're making decisions obedient to God. And, a lot of times people don't understand that. So there is an element of loneliness or feeling misunderstood.
Yeah.
But I like the way you framed it. Where does that drive you? Where does that lead you to?
Yeah, I would say leadership is definitely lonely. Some of the loneliest places. Jesus was consistently in a lonely place. I mean, think about the people he didn't have around him. Like the lack of like close, confidant friends. He had like 3.
Mm-hmm.
His disciples were consistently, I think, making him feel more lonely more often than they made him feel camaraderie. I think he was always the lightning rod of camaraderie among them. But but he was constantly trying. First of all, he's trying to get alone, and it had to have been a pretty lonely place,
Right.
and I think it culminated when he was in the garden at the end.
Yeah.
Like, that is lonely.
Yeah.
But even that, like using your example, relates to what Marley said about the difference between, or maybe not the difference, but the distinction between loneliness and solitude.
Yeah.
You know, before every major decision, like Jesus was so countercultural. After miracles would happen, and then he retreats in solitude to be with the Father, to pray. And I just always in my mind picture that as like him submitting his will.
Right.
Because like, if we were a part of miracles, we would be like Instagramming that thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he did the total opposite.
Yeah. Well, and you kind of touched on this too, Carrie, with what you're saying at the beginning there. I think we as people kind of classify what we call loneliness. I think, like you said, is more that almost emptiness and that lack of being understood. There's so much that can kind of go into it. But the way I see it, and the way that I kind of, especially after hearing how Pastor Marlize sort of broke it down, and the three, I really liked the Venn diagram that she kind of came up with, and I like that it started as a single circle and grew, because I do think that there is that sort of path that we have to walk, because ultimately, when we talk about loneliness, the way that what we're really saying is, I don't feel, like you said, understood or known. And that's why I think when we talk about Jesus, Josh, like you were just talking about, he felt so alone because nobody, even his disciples, struggled to understand him.
Yeah.
Yep.
Even his disciples struggled to really know what he was doing, and how much that probably, at least the human, well, even the godly side of him, how much that must wear on him, because and God himself, and thank God is so gracious. Pastor Marlize said, who are you sticking with? And that God always sticks with us, which thank God, because, but so that's kind of how I don't think it really is loneliness, what we're talking about. It is, but again, it's not, like you said, it's not being alone. It's more that wanting to feel known, and it's almost that emptiness that really only God can fill. And then once he does, then we can become confident in ourselves and who we are, and that brings in that what was that word? I want to say isolation, but that's not right. Was it
Solitude?
Solitude, yeah. So it's solitude instead of loneliness, and then when we start putting ourselves around people, we now have we're not looking for them to give us what only God can,
right.
And I think that, because that's something I've always struggled with. Because, again, when it comes to loneliness, I think we all sort of struggle with it in a different way. And that's why it's hard to sort of talk about it. There's really no magic bullet for loneliness, because it is, I think, a journey that we go on. Mm-hmm. And depending on where you are in the journey, loneliness will feel different to you. So where I've always struggled with it is exactly that, having good friends, close friends. And I'm not trying to disparage anybody I know, but still having that feeling of like, this isn't doing anything for me, but realizing that, well, that's because you're trying to have them fill something, but God is trying to be that. And he's the only one who can, and until you start going to him for things, then you'll start adjusting in it. But I think when you're at different parts in that walk, it'll sort of present in different ways. And that's why there are so many, kind of getting back to those assumptions that she made about loneliness. Right. That's why I think there's so many of them, because they all are born out of that different spot. Wherever you are in that sort of walk of loneliness and community, you'll kind of feel different things. And like the first one, is there something wrong with me? Because like maybe other people are in a different spot, and so they seem fine because they're dealing with it in a different way, and other things like that. I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on that kind of sort of spectrum of loneliness?
I definitely do. One of the things I was thinking about, she didn't use this word, but Marlize was talking about loneliness as a result of sin. And I know we all have different faith backgrounds, but sometimes I don't think we talk enough about the effect of sin.
Yeah.
Because there's so much this stuff around it, depending on our faith context or whatever. But, in the beginning, there's a reason why when God was giving instructions, it's for our benefit. And I love Marlize talked about feeling disconnected from ourselves. And that can lead to loneliness. And I think sometimes that's happening because of sin, which is, the way she explained it, choices where we separate ourselves from God. God never moves.
Right.
He never leaves us, but we make choices. We put our hope and our trust in other things. So I think that's really something to think about, because we own our lives. We own our choices. We're ridiculously in charge of our lives. And sometimes we're just going so fast, or maybe we don't want to face certain hurts. So we just keep making choices that are ultimately sin, but we don't want to admit it. And it's creating a distance within ourselves. So I think that's kind of one sphere of loneliness that, maybe I don't know if it's, we don't want to own our choices. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's true. And that's another thing that she kind of touched on, that separation. And I think that's something we often overlook, is that one, thanks to sin, we've all started disconnected from God. And even though, you're born, you have a family, it's such a sort of contrast, because you have, when you're born, and as someone who has a newborn, it's constant. You are constantly with people and cared for and loved, but God, who is the one who wants ultimate relationship with us, he created us for relationship with him. And I think we forget that too. He didn't make us just because we're like ants in a farm that he likes watching, whatever chaos we come up with here on earth. Yeah. He created us for relationship, and sin has broken that relationship. And now he is always calling to us to come back to him. And I think that's why that distinction in loneliness really needs to be made, because if you're saying, I'm lonely because I don't have enough friends, God's sitting there like, no, it doesn't matter. You could have 100 friends, you could have 1,000 friends, and you could be really close with those friends. Yeah. But until you have me in that relationship, you're always going to feel that, what you would call loneliness. But really, like you were saying again at the beginning, it's really that emptiness, that lack of really knowing who you are. Because how can you know who you are? Because we all are children of God. And until we know God, we're never going to know that, Yeah. And it's such we have to grow in that, I think, before we can really stop feeling as lonely. And sin is such a part of that. And especially even after salvation, because sin and guilt, that's the biggest. We've talked about this a couple weeks ago with the devil, He's trying to guilt you and take you away from God, where God is saying, no, it's fine. It's fine. I forgive you. I love you. Like, come to me. That's the point. Repent and come to me. Whereas our guilt and sin is like, oh, I got to hide from God and I have to separate from God. And it really is up to us who we want to be with. And it's hard to remember sometimes. And I know I struggle with that. I don't know if you guys can talk to this at all, but exactly that, of like isolating myself from God out of not even necessarily shame and guilt, just like it just happens, it's so easy for it to happen, which is, when you think about it, when we talk about it like this, it's like so crazy, but it's also so natural. It's such a natural thing for us to do as humans. And why do you guys think that is? What do you think kind of causes that?
It's a great question, Gordon. I think we like to mask things with, what would the word be? It's almost like you're masking. There's a word for it, but I don't know what it is. Almost like you're supplementing something for something else.
Counterfeit?
Substituting?
Kind of like a counterfeit. Like you are filling your life. I find that I can do this. Like sometimes I'll fill my life with activities or things to kind of mask the fact that I don't want to deal with some perceived loneliness in my soul, or the fact that there's unresolved offense in my life. It's interesting how it can kind of work itself out in very unique ways, but also like not really unique. I think we kind of fool ourselves into thinking that it's unique, and that we're actually doing a good job of masking our problems with things. And I think it's just like this. It can be difficult, I think, at times to really deal with the stuff that's going on in your soul, because it's going to call to account how you prioritize your life. It's going to call to account where you put your time and how you spend your time, which is why sometimes the most lonely people are the most active, extroverted people.
Yes.
Which is why mental health is such a important thing, because if you're not honest with yourself and with other people, you don't actually know what people are struggling with. And then you get these like horrendous stories of people who are making life-ending decisions because of loneliness that's unresolved and goes unresolved and unchecked for years. And then it's too much to handle. And they make incredibly sad decisions to end everything. And the story is so often the same. Like, they were so happy.
Yeah.
They had such a good family. They were always the life of the party. They were funny. They were like, everybody wanted to be around them. But then on the inside, they were masking like deep-seated loneliness. And I think it's and it comes out in so many different ways. Addiction is a good mask for loneliness, because if I can just get this hit, I don't have to deal with the pain that I'm going to go through tonight. I can be myself. It's actually a scary place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Because again, and I think we can all agree here, loneliness is such a universal feeling. Like, we've all been, maybe not to that level that you're talking about, Josh, but we all feel lonely, and yet we all struggle to be open with friends. And, we can have really close friends, but they, we're like afraid to tell them, like, hey, I'm not doing good. Like, I need something right now. I need, you to just come and support me right now and pray with me, or just be with me, or whatever, and I don't know why that is. It seems to be such a common, I don't know. I haven't interviewed, a lot of people about this, but I feel very confident in making that assumption that, like, we've all been there. We've all wanted to, like, I just wanted to tell someone that I'm not doing good right now, and that I could use a friend or a companion, or even crying out to God. And, you can do that too.
Yeah.
And yet we don't. We just sit there like, oh, I wish I could. It's like, do it, and I'm saying this at myself. I'm not trying to put this on anybody else, but it can be almost paralyzing, and why this particular thing, because we can struggle with a lot of things that are hard to talk about. Other sins, there's other sins that, and I'm not saying loneliness is sin, but there is sin that is hard to be open with, and say, like, hey, I'm struggling with this too, addiction or whatever. So I'm not saying this is the only thing that's hard, but this seems to be the most universal. We all kind of struggle with it in ways, and also struggle the most, I think, with being honest with people about dealing with it.
Yeah.
It makes me think of, I love Ephesians 1, and we read it this morning in prayer.
Yeah.
There's a part in there that talks about how, we're made in God's image, and he's happy about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of loneliness comes from a lack of understanding that God loves us. So when we are so afraid of rejection, we pretend, we wear masks, we numb ourselves. And it's so interesting, like, hearing Josh, as you were talking, I got so emotional, because there's a very close friend of our family who a couple of years ago took his own life, and he was everything you described. Like, the life of the party, just one of the most incredible men. And it took everyone by such surprise, but, thinking about the things that he probably never spoke about. And And I think when we don't understand that we're made in God's image, we want to hide the things that we feel shame about, which is which was, Satan's original plan, right? Like, let's go back to the garden, cover now we have to cover ourselves, because in the beginning, Adam and Eve had no shame.
Right.
But we can try to hide in a million different ways, and some are just more socially acceptable than others. When we can never be alone, it's actually probably an addiction. Mm-hmm. It's just more socially acceptable than drinking or doing drugs. But at the end of the day, an addiction is a compulsion, and we're usually trying to run from something. Mm-hmm. And in communion, God's always calling us into communion. So if we don't have that feeling of safety, I can come to the Lord in my brokenness. Yeah. And it's funny, like, even I think the more we run, the harder it is to stop and face some of this stuff, right? Because it feels like so much. And I'm in a very busy season right now. So I took a day off last week, and I was like, okay, I'm going to go be alone. And my fiance, Josh, was like, you were alone. You weren't alone. You were like visiting your grandma. You were hanging out with family. You were doing stuff with friends. And he was so right. Yeah. Like, I had pockets of alone time, but he was like, Carrie, you can tell that to other people, but I know what your schedule was, and you avoided the very thing that you really needed. And I had it in pockets, but I really was like, wow, you're right. Like, it is hard. It's hard to find that solitude. And I don't think it's because we don't want to be alone. I think it's because we're like, I have to just process some stuff.
Yeah. I think too, it's like we don't even maybe know how to be alone.
Right.
Because, and this is sort of the oxymoron of the whole thing is, if I'm using that word correctly, I don't know, I'm not an English major, but we're alone, but God is always with us, and he wants to be with us when in that time of alone. And we talk about Jesus. Jesus went to be alone with God, in prayer with God, And I think that, like you're saying, and you were just saying, Carrie, that if we don't start with our relationship with God, we can never get to the other parts that Pastor Marlize was talking about, because it's all predicated first on, one, knowing God, and then two, knowing how God sees you. Because that breaks down a lot of those other walls that you were talking about. Because I totally get that feeling of, especially when you're in something, you want a immediate fix. But if you've been, like you said, running for so long, it feels like too far. It's like, I can only take a step right now. I can't make that whole distance. And so it gets overwhelming. And if anything, like you said, it really is an addiction. You keep avoiding it and filling that void with other things. But the truth is that God is right. There is no distance, but we don't see that. We struggle to see that there is no distance and that God is with us. And that if we really understood that, it would solve so many problems. But it's so hard to truly know that, especially in that place, because to get to that place, you essentially, like you were saying, Carrie, have to run away from that truth, or maybe run away from is not the right word, but you're not in that truth, because if you were in that truth, you wouldn't have gotten to that place, and then it feels hard to break out of it, even though God is right there with us in it. Right. He's ready, but again, and as Pastor Marlize was saying on Sunday, like, we are the gatekeepers of our relationship with God. We make that decision, and it can be so hard. It almost doesn't. And again, I'm just talking from my own experience. So if you don't feel this way, that honestly, I'm very happy for you. But because it almost feels like we forget that it's an option. Yes. I forget that it's an option sometimes. I'll just kind of catch myself sometimes, be like, why haven't you been praying?
Yeah.
Like, why are you just sitting here avoiding, just trying to, like, I don't know, feel better, whatever that means. It's like, why are you not going to God right now? Why are you not letting him come meet you in this place and be here with you in this place? Because you can't. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, because if I did, I wouldn't struggle with it, but it's so easy to get clouded and not see God. And that's kind of probably true with many other things as well, but especially when we're talking about this, you need that first, because then you can start saying, well, I know who I am as a child of God, so I'm okay being alone right now, and I want to be alone right now. And then you say, okay, well, I know who I am as a child of God. I'm comfortable on my own because I know he's with me. And now I want to go have good fellowship and communion with my brothers and sisters in Christ, you know, and it really is that kind of 1, 2, 3. It's not all at once. And I would kind of encourage people who maybe, I think that can even be overwhelming, you know, thinking you have to do all these things at once. No, it really is first this, then that, then, and then you have all 3 of those circles, and you're meeting in the middle of that Venn diagram that was used in the message on Sunday.
I like the part in this notes here. It's at the end. I don't know if we can jump around.
Go.
We
Yeah,
do whatever
please.
We want.
Yeah.
We do whatever we want here.
Just
beyond the message. Is
Beyond.
Sorry. Jeez.
Oh boy.
The who do you stick with? Because I think it actually kind of coincides with some of the stuff. Obviously, it coincides with some of the stuff we've been talking about. But I just think it's such a interesting, this whole idea of who do you confide in, like where's your loneliness rooted in, I think is a really important conversation for people to be having with themselves and with the people close to them, because like who do you stick with? And there's actually a couple verses in Proverbs where it says, there's one that says a man of many companions may come to ruin, but there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Which is such an important proverb, because it's like, yeah, you can have a lot of companions, a lot of friends, but it might not mean anything. But there actually is a friend who's going to stick closer than a brother. And I like to think that he was, maybe unbeknownst to Solomon writing it, I think he was referring to Jesus in that verse. But then he also wrote it later in Proverbs that the wounds of a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses.
Yep.
And I think it's very easy to surround ourselves with people who just like kind of affirm how we live, affirm our choices, affirm, just paths that we go down. Yeah. But they never actually get to the heart of why we're doing what we're doing, why we act the way we act. Like, what are you, like, are there things in your heart that you're actually trying to hide? Are you not being honest with yourself? And it's counterintuitive, because like getting kissed is much better than being wounded. But the wounds of a friend can be trusted. So I periodically ask myself, like, who is in my life that is actually telling me, like, to watch myself? Like, who's telling me the hard stuff? Like, who am I? Luckily, I'm married to someone who has zero issue telling me the hard things. I think it's like, who do you stick with? Who are you surrounding yourself with? You just surround yourself with yes people, because it will destroy your life. You'll start making decisions that are just so outlandish and will actually perpetuate the loneliness that you're feeling.
100%.
And you're actually like, it feels good in the moment to be kissed, and then you realize, crap, I'm still stressed out. I'm loaded with anxiety. But I got to keep putting the face on.
Which is literally the cycle of addiction, right? Like, there's an emptiness, a void, a need. So we seek a high, we come down from the high, and it just keeps going.
Right.
Some of my favorite authors are in recovery, because there is this brutal honesty about things that everyone else wants to kind of cover up. Like, they've been to the end of themselves and seen like their absolute weakness, but also the strength that comes when we acknowledge that, Christ can finally work through us. And that honesty can be a scary thing, like you were saying earlier, Josh.
Yeah.
I remember I was in a seminary class years ago. I used to audit, and this guy had pastored for like over 50 years. He was the professor. He was so great. And he said, when you look for a spouse, look for someone who won't buy into the highlights or the accolades of people around you. Yeah. They'll see you for the sinner that you are, and they'll love you anyways.
Right.
And I just loved that so much. It reminded me of what you were just talking about with Esther, you know, like they're going to love you.
Yeah.
But they're also going to be honest with you because they love you.
Yeah. Well, and that is such a key thing about love that I think gets lost a lot today, especially with God. And usually it's more with people who don't believe in God, but they're like, oh, I thought God loves everybody. It's like, love does not mean just letting you do what you're doing if it's hurting you, you know? And that's what you were just talking about. And Josh, what you were talking about with having those good friends and good fellowship where sometimes love is saying, hey, what are you doing? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a really random tangent, but I've been studying in John, and in John 21, when Jesus is resurrected, and he's talking with Peter. You know, a lot of us know the scripture, Peter, do you love me?
Yeah.
Peter, do you love me? Peter. Did you know that the first 2 times, so it says that Jesus asked him that twice, and then he asked him a third time, and the third time Peter was hurt. The first 2 times that Jesus asked Peter that, he asks them, do you agape love me? The third time, it's actually a different word. It's the phileo.
Is it not the other way around?
No.
Oh, I thought it was,
I'm sorry.
It's
yes.
agape the third time, right?
Yes, it's agape the third time. And so we were talking about that in our Bible study this week, the different types of love and what love requires.
Yeah.
And honesty being part of it. Because then we went off on these tangents of like, well, maybe Peter was hurt because that's when he faced his denial of Jesus before.
Right.
And yet still being received by Jesus and loved by Jesus. Because he still says, like, I want to use you to build my church. So sometimes like that phileo love from God, it's like when we come before him in our deepest disappointments or things we want to hide, it can be really hard to then just still receive.
Yeah.
But you know, that's the difference between Judas and Peter, you know, and I think the same can be said in our friendships, you know, when we don't want to receive that forgiveness from other people.
Well, and I think that kind of gets to, you know, I kind of asked that question, like, why do we deal with this so much? And I think that really plays into it a lot, because loneliness will almost tell you, like, you don't deserve love, you know, or maybe not even you don't deserve it, but nobody loves you because I'm alone. So obviously if I was loved, I wouldn't be alone, you know? And God is sitting there like with Peter, just being like, no, what? No, I love you so much.
Yes.
And I only want to love you and have a relationship with you, you know? And you're the one who's not receiving it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Right.
And that's such a necessary reframing where it's never that God doesn't love you. And close friends, family, it's never that, I don't, you know, of course you can find human exceptions to every rule, but
sure.
Let's assume we have a nice, normal, loving relationship. It's never that I don't love you. It's that you're not receiving it right now because you don't want to hear the truth, or you don't, you know, you're stuck in something, but it's because you're not receiving it, not that it's not being given.
Right.
And with God, it's not that God gives it in such an overflowing, massive amount. And even still, we're like, I don't want it. You know, I'm going to convince myself that I don't need it, or I don't deserve it, or whatever. And that's it's so sad. And we all do it. I do it. You know, we all have been there and done that. And and we'll do it again. That's the worst part. Even having this conversation, all 3 of us, I'm sure at one point are going to do it again. You know,
absolutely. Because we're fallible humans.
Yeah.
You know, but the reality is that in our loneliness, there's an invitation to communion. I mean, look at Moses. You know, Moses was born into like the biggest identity crisis ever.
Yeah.
You know, his adoptive parents enslaved his biological family, and then he's righteously upset about injustice, acts out, and goes into the wilderness. But it's in the wilderness, he chose solitude, not just to be alone, but he chose to receive from God. He murdered a guy. You know, he had to face that ugliness about himself when he probably was like, God, I acted out of justice to take the life of an oppressor. And yet he had to receive that wasn't the right decision, and yet God still loved him. So in our loneliness, back to Josh's point at the very beginning, there's always invitation to transformation.
Yeah.
But it's like the furnace of where old stuff has to die off. And sometimes we don't choose to allow that to happen. And I think that's why even as we progress, you can say in leadership and maturity, whatever, it can feel even more lonely because the majority of people may not choose to do that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean it's wrong. And when we're connected to the Lord, that's where we receive our affirmation that it's okay if it feels lonely, you know?
Right.
Using Moses as the example, like he probably, going back to Egypt probably felt crazy. His own people rejected him.
Right.
Yeah.
But he was abiding in Christ.
But yeah, and that, as we've been saying, that that's where the different phases almost of loneliness comes in, right? Because especially with leadership, I always sympathize with church leaders, especially because, and I don't necessarily mean that, as leaders, you guys are somehow so much better, but at the same time,
definitely not it.
But at the same time, Pastor Pierre cannot on a Sunday get up in front of us and be like, "Hey guys, here's what I've been dealing with this week." We can't, that's not how that, and it's you have a smaller group of confidants that you can go to, of whether it be other church leaders or whatever, and that's that's where that aloneness comes in, because now it's, who can I talk to about this? Who can understand what I'm dealing with leading a church or whatever comes with that, or what
complexity.
Exactly, and for Moses, how do you, what? You're the prince of Egypt, but also the free, you're going to free Israel from your home, and so that's where it's like, well, who do I even go to about this? Maybe I'm confident in God and I'm confident in that solitude, but then that's that next step is, well, I'm still alone. Now I'm physically alone. And that's where that physical side of loneliness comes in, where, I do just need someone who can talk to me about this.
Right.
And who can I talk to about that? And Josh, that's what you were saying about having those dear friends. We need to make sure we have those, and that we're willing, again, to be open with them and honest with them and hear what they're saying about this kind of stuff that we're struggling with.
Yeah.
It's good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any other thoughts there, Josh? Or
I don't know that I do. I think that, I don't necessarily know that I have more thoughts.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow, Gordon says.
Yeah.
Have some more coffee, Josh.
Yeah.
We'll get back to you.
Listen, I just think that it's a part. Yeah, I feel like we've said some very good and helpful things.
Yeah.
I think that not enough can be said about trusting people. It'd be interesting. There's a book called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and it really goes through kind of interrelational dynamics in an organizational team. And if the team doesn't trust each other, nothing else can actually move forward with the team. Like if there's a lack of trust, it's like the foundation of all things. And like that book, it ends with results. Like a company wants to get results, but in your relationships, in your friendships, there's an element where there are some results to be had. I mean, obviously not doing performance reviews with your friends, but there's an element where there is things that you can get from a relationship that are beneficial to your life. But if you don't have a foundation of trust, like if you don't trust yourself, if you don't trust God, if you don't trust other people, you will always have superficial relationships.
Right.
Anybody who says like, "Oh, I have such a hard time trusting people," well, that's a dangerous place to be.
Yeah.
Because you're always going to be lacking healthy relationships that you need. And I mean, I don't think healthy relationships isn't the answer to all mental health issues.
Right.
I'm not saying that. Counseling and therapy are incredibly important. God created doctors with great minds to produce great medication. Stuff can help, but not enough can be said for trusting people and having solid relationships.
Well, and even still, right, mental health and that kind of stuff leads you to trusting people.
Yes.
Right? That is a tool to get, because that is a hard question. It's easy to say trust people, but you don't know what I've been through, and that's fair. It is hard to trust people, but you have to find tools that can give you that courage to trust at some point. And if you need to get to that point, and there's many ways to do that. So I think what you were saying, Josh, that kind of goes hand in hand. I don't think it's two separate things. It's, okay, we need to get to trust, but we understand that people hurt our trust constantly. We've all been hurt. And God, it's hard to trust God too sometimes.
Yes, and I think I just was having a conversation with someone recently about, they didn't frame it this way, but this is, I think ultimately sometimes we are not honest about our expectations.
Right.
So we hold other people or God to expectations that we're not verbalizing or we don't even realize we have. And when those expectations aren't met, we feel disappointed or rejected, which can lead to loneliness.
Yeah.
But when we take time to just be introspective and actually reflect honest conversations with yourself, we can begin to communicate that to God and realize maybe this is actually an unrealistic expectation.
Right.
And lay that down, because the reality is that people will disappoint and hurt us. And if every time that happens, you're derailed as a person, it's going to be a roller coaster of a life.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the best things I've learned from Pierre is everyone is ultimately doing the best they can. And of course, God gives us wisdom and discernment, but choosing to believe the best in each person while also knowing that ultimately there's disappointments will come and that's okay.
Yeah.
Is a really important lesson to learn, because you can't live your life without getting hurt by people, and it can't drive you into despair every time.
Yeah.
So it's a balance. You can live a really lonely life by just playing the victim, but ultimately, I think when we put our expectations in the right place, we're living more honestly.
Absolutely. And that expectation, I think, is so important, because I think we do this a lot, where we put on other people expectations that only God can meet.
Yeah.
And we, for whatever reason, do that. And that's so unfair, because like you're saying, Carrie, we're all trying our best, but nobody's God.
Right.
Nobody can do what God can do. Some of the work that needs to be done by God. And so when you have those mixed expectations, it's hopeless then, because you're never going to have those needs met by people. And if that's where you're going and that's the expectations you're setting on people, you could have the best friend who is like the best, perfect, awesome friend. It's like, you're still not going to get that feeling that you need, that contentment of belonging. And I love that was what Pastor Marlize used with God, is belonging. It's not just identity. It's not just knowing. It's knowing that you belong with God. And that's what loneliness is that search for belonging. It's more than just, I want to be around people. It's, I want to find a place where I belong. And physically, there is no place that we can belong in to the level that we do belong in the kingdom of God. And that emotional belonging can only be met by the kingdom of God. And then we walk it out, of course, as church and with groups and with friends, but I think that's why it has to start with God. And when you have that belonging, then you can get through anything and figure out the rest of it.
It's great.
This has been a great discussion. Carrie, thank you for your openness and sharing that story. Josh as well, thank you for being here, guys. Great discussion. I really enjoyed this. Hopefully you all enjoyed it too. We enjoy talking about this kind of stuff, and we will be back next week as we continue. Who's speaking next week? Do we?
Guy from New York City is coming in.
Oh, exciting.
CJ.
Exciting.
CJ, woo!
CJ.
All right. Well, we're having a guest speaker next week. That's exciting. We'll be here to talk about his message. We will see you on Sunday. Be sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel so you don't miss an episode of Beyond the Message. We will see you guys next week. Goodbye.